When I first heard Frances's voice that evening, I wasn't listening on purpose. I was only on my way through the kitchen, my chipped mug in hand, planning to refill my tea. She paced barefoot across the tile, the phone pressed to her ear, her free hand cutting sharp gestures through the air the way she always did when irritated. Her words stopped me mid-step. She doesn't even notice it. Her room stinks. It's like nursing home air. Heavy like old fabric, and something medical. A short, clipped laugh followed one I didn't recognize. My mug wobbled in my grip, and I caught it with my other palm before it spilled. I wasn't hidden. I wasn't eavesdropping. I simply stood there in the open doorway, her voice carrying without shame or secrecy. It seeps into the hallway, she went on. I've sprayed the whole floor, but it clings to everything. I backed away slowly, slippers silent against the wood, my pulse steady but heavy, and returned to the guest room where I stayed. I closed the door softly, not to sneak, but to protect something inside me that had been cracked too suddenly open. The tea was already cold. I set it on the dresser beside the folded nightgowns, the bottle of vitamins, and a picture of Frances at 7 years old, grinning toothless. I studied her little face, the child who once begged for one more lullaby, who wept when I left for night shifts, who painted me secret pictures with sticky fingers. That same face now brushed past me without a touch, thanking me for folding laundry like I was some polite stranger instead of her mother. I picked up my mug again, ran my thumb across the widening crack on its rim, and sat by the window. Outside, the roses I had planted last spring were brittle at the edges, struggling against too much sun, still standing, but tired, much like myself. When I opened my closet, I touched the garment bag where I had kept a pink linen dress. I'd bought it as a gift to myself upon retirement, delicate pleats, a soft collar, mother-of-pearl buttons, but never wore it. I had imagined brunches in sunlit cafes with friends, white tablecloths, laughter. But the brunches never came. The friends passed on or moved away. Instead, I moved into Frances's guest room with one suitcase and a promise that it was only for a little while. The stroke had arrived quietly 3 months after my 77th birthday. Not catastrophic, but enough to make mornings uncertain and walking unsteady. Frances called immediately. "You shouldn't be alone. Stay with us until things settle." I sold my condo, then the south-facing place I thought would carry me through my last years. The proceeds had helped with the down payment on their new house, my savings buried in their closing papers. At first, it felt like a shared home. I baked muffins, minded the twins, paid bills without being asked. But slowly, my boxes shifted to the garage, my chair disappeared from the living room, my name vanished from the Wi-Fi note. I became a hum in the background, the folded towels, the extra hand at pickup. I told myself they were busy, stretched thin, just like I had once been. But excuses could not warm the cold way a staircase feels when no one waits at the top. I still checked on the pink dress sometimes, slid the zipper down, touched the fabric, then hid it again. I watered tomatoes out back, though Frances had asked me once to move them. They don't really go with the aesthetic, she'd said. I nodded, carried them behind the shed, fought mildew and squirrels, kept tending them quietly, because even things left in the shadows deserved care. The twins grew polite but distant. "Hi, Grandma," they would mumble, their arms glued to their sides. Once, when I reached to fix a collar, Ben flinched, not in fear, but in reflex, as though my hand belonged to someone unfamiliar. I kept baking muffins, but they grabbed protein bars instead. Then came the candle. Frances had left it burning outside my door, one of those designer ones labeled clean linen. It smelled like bleach and apology. When I asked, she said, "Don't take it personally. The hallway just feels stuffy sometimes." I nodded again, but I did take it personally. I took it personally when they closed the pantry door while I was reaching, when they re-wiped dishes I had already cleaned, when they offered a smile in place of a refusal. The tomatoes were dying, I thought, but I would plant them again next spring. That night, searching for stamps in the office, I stumbled on a burgundy folder marked estate planning in Frances's neat handwriting. I knew better than to pry, but something in me, instinct or exhaustion, compelled me. I opened it. Inside were brochures for assisted living notes scribbled about my life insurance highlights, around expiration dates, annotations beside my savings account. Will need access if medical decline accelerates. There were even calculations of my property's value. My own will, marked with Frances's pen, sat there like evidence of my worth reduced to numbers. I copied every page, every note, and tucked them into a manila folder I labeled, "When They Forget I'm Still Alive." I didn't confront her. There was no point. If she thought arranging where I'd be stored next was reasonable, she would not suddenly ask where I wanted to live. But I remembered something Gracie Morrison once told me before. Cancer took her voice. There's a co-op, not where people go to die, but where they go to live, with gardens and windows and neighbors who remember your name. I had brushed it off then. Now I went to see. Hidden behind crepe myrtles, 10 small units each with its own porch. Lavender scented the air, real lavender, not candle smoke. Tomatoes strung on twine brushes and gloves ready on shelves. A woman named Margot greeted me like she had been waiting. "No rush," she said, gesturing to the common room where women played Scrabble, and a man read by the fireplace. I didn't take a brochure. I asked for an application. She smiled, told me a unit had just opened, and held it for me 24 hours. I said yes before doubt could reach me. When I got home, I called my old lawyer, Mr. Teague. "Clarine," he said, "I figured I'd hear from you one day." I told him what I'd seen in Frances's folder, what I planned to do. His voice was careful, but unsurprised. "Your name is still on the deed. You own the house outright. You have full authority." Relief loosened something in my chest. "Then I'd like to speak to a realtor," I said. He gave me a name discreet and professional. I wrote it down in my checkbook, staring at the ink, like it was a new beginning. The next morning, I began to sort not yet to pack. Shoes unworn for years, sweaters that still smelled of cedar, my mother's quilt, my sewing tin. I labeled 3 boxes, keep donate, not for them. 17 boxes lined up by the end of the week. Frances left for a conference in Asheville that Friday morning, rushing the kids into the car with cereal bowls still in the sink and sunscreen forgotten on the counter. The door slammed, leaving the house in silence, so deep it felt almost holy. I waited 15 minutes, boiled water poured my tea, then opened the window to let the morning air touch my face. By 10:00 a.m., Margot arrived with a man named Elgin in an unmarked van. They didn't ask questions. They didn't remark on the house. They simply helped me carry out 17 boxes, 2 suitcases, and the tomato pots I had tended behind the shed. I didn't take everything, just what mattered. My quilt, the photograph of Frances as a child, with her toothless grin, the pink linen dress, my Bible, and a shoebox of letters from people who had known me before I was reduced to wallpaper. I wiped the counters, straightened the mugs, closed the cabinets. I knew Frances hated it when things were left ajar. Then I placed a folded note in the center of the granite counter. My handwriting read, "The house has been sold. You have 30 days to move. Please don't call." No name, no signature. Just the truth written plainly. Then I picked up my chipped mug, slipped my gardening gloves into the crook of my arm, and walked to the front door. I didn't turn back, not even once. Margot held the van door open for me. The sunlight was soft across the lawn, the same lawn I once mowed before arthritis changed my grip. As we pulled away, the house shrank in the side mirror until it was gone, and no one shouted after me. By the time they returned, the silence would be deafening. At the co-op, my new unit was small but bright. Windows spilled light across the kitchen where I unpacked the china I had saved for decades. My quilt fit perfectly across the bed. My pink linen dress hung in a place of honor at the front of the closet. By evening, I brewed tea and sat by a window that looked out onto lavender bushes just beginning to bloom. Margot stopped by with lemon scones from the bakery down the road. She smiled softly, set the bag on my counter, and said, "You look lighter already." She didn't pry, didn't demand explanations. I hadn't told anyone what I had done, and maybe I never would. The phone began ringing that night. First one voicemail, then another, then another. I let them pile up while I watched a documentary about beekeeping. By 7:30 p.m., the tone had shifted from frantic to furious to quiet. Francis's voice cracked on the line. "You tricked us." I took a sip of tea unbothered. I hadn't tricked anyone. I had simply stopped playing the role they had written for me without my consent. They had depended on my silence, my obedience, my reluctance to make waves. They never imagined I would leave. Strength doesn't always announce itself with shouting. Sometimes it shows up in boxes stacked neatly in a signature, on a deed, in a decision carried through without fanfare. I turned the phone off and slid it into a drawer, then opened the journal I hadn't touched since Jorge died. On the first page, I wrote Day 1, and beneath it, "No one asked me to shrink today." The words felt like air filling a lung that had been starved. Tomorrow, I promised myself I would plant lavender in the window box. It was only 2 days later when I heard the knock, 3 hesitant taps. I opened the door, and there stood Caleb, his backpack slung over one shoulder. His sneakers scuffed his gaze downcast. Taller than I remembered, thinner, but his voice was the same. "I told Mom I had chess club," he admitted. "I don't. I just wanted to see if you were okay." Before I could answer, he stepped forward and hugged me. Not the polite lean-in hug teenagers give at holidays, but something firm, almost desperate. Wordless. Inside, he glanced around the small apartment, as though it were some dream he hadn't been permitted to believe in. "It smells like cookies," he said. "It could," I answered, "if we make some." His grin broke open. We baked together, his hands clumsy with eggs and flour, his laughter spilling when he got more sugar on the counter than in the bowl. He ate dough raw from the spoon, and I didn't correct him once. Between small jokes, he looked at me serious for a moment. "You were always there, you know. At every game, every school thing. I never noticed." His voice lowered. "I'm sorry. I didn't need the apology, but it landed like something soft after years of stone." We ate cookies, warm from the oven, with 2 glasses of milk, and the kitchen smelled of vanilla and brown sugar long after he had left. When he finally stood to go, he tucked a cookie into his hoodie pocket and asked, "Can I come again next week?" I nodded. "Anytime, but only if you want to." He nodded back, quiet but certain, and walked down the path to wherever he had to lie next. When I closed the door, I realized I no longer felt like a ghost in someone else's house. I felt like someone worth visiting. The lavender in my window box sprouted early that year. Maybe it was the new soil. Maybe it was the quiet mornings. I pulled back the curtains each day, sat in my armchair, and let the sunlight touch me fully. Sometimes I journaled, sometimes I sketched, sometimes I simply watched. Neighbors waved when they passed. Margot brought a basil plant. Harold, from 2 doors down, lent me a mystery novel, its margins filled with penciled guesses at the ending. At lunch in the common room, people asked questions and waited for the answers. No one sighed when I took my time. One afternoon, I joined a watercolor class. I hadn't painted since high school, but my hands remembered more than I thought. My first painting was of a lavender stem in a chipped mug. They pinned it on the wall by Thursday, and I felt seen in a way I hadn't in years. The phone rang again. I ignored it the first day, then the second. On the third, I answered. Francis's voice was low, urgent, carrying a guilt that sounded more like defense. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry you felt that way. I never meant to make you think you weren't welcome. I was just overwhelmed. You could have talked to me." She hesitated, then added, "You didn't have to make it such a statement." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't recount the candles or the brochures or the way they erased me one knot at a time. I simply said, "I am no longer available to be disrespected." Then I hung up, gently stepped outside, and touched the lavender. Its color was deeper now, the stems taller. A bee landed without hesitation, unbothered by my presence. The air smelled like something I remembered from long ago, clean, bright, and earned. The days at the co-op began to follow a rhythm, one that felt natural in a way I hadn't experienced for years. Morning light slid across the kitchen table, the air filled with the gentle hum of conversation drifting from the courtyard outside. I watered the lavender in my window box, brushed my fingers along the stems, and watched the bees linger. Some mornings, I baked muffins again, not because anyone expected them, but because I wanted to. When I set a plate out in the common room, neighbors helped themselves with smiles and thanks crumbs, trailing back to their tables, where laughter and stories continued without pause. No one pushed them aside for protein bars. No one ignored them. Caleb came on Thursdays, slipping in with the same half-grin shaking flour onto the counters, leaving chocolate smudges on his sleeve. He never stayed too long, his mother's reach was still strong, but he came often enough that it felt like a promise. One afternoon, as he stirred sugar into a bowl, he said quietly, "It feels better here. You feel better here." I didn't correct him. He was right. When he left that evening, he hugged me again, less desperately this time, more like he wanted me to know he understood. The messages from Francis shifted week by week. First indignant, then pleading, then quiet. One voicemail cracked with restrained anger. "You didn't have to sell the house. We would have figured something out." Another tried to soften the edges. "The kids miss you. Can we talk about how to make this work?" But the words rang hollow. If they had missed me, they would have noticed me long before I left. I didn't call back. I didn't need to. Instead, I filled my time with small, deliberate acts. I joined the gardening group, crouched low in the soil, alongside women who hummed old hymns under their breath while planting beans. I learned to play dominoes at the long wooden table, my laughter echoing with theirs when I inevitably lost. I signed up for watercolor again this time, painting the tomatoes I had rescued from behind Francis's shed. In the new soil under open sun, they were thriving green stalks, rising strong blossoms, already promising fruit. When I looked at them, I saw myself reflected, not gone, not diminished. Still here, still growing, still capable of sweetness. One Sunday, Margot invited me to the small chapel tucked into the back wing of the co-op. I hadn't sat in a pew for years, not since Jorge's passing, but the quiet felt less heavy here. No one watched to see if I faltered. No one measured my devotion. I simply sat, whispered a prayer, and let the music of voices wrap around me. It reminded me of the lullabies I once sang to Frances when she was small, the kind that soothed without demanding anything in return. Frances finally stopped calling. The silence stretched long, but I didn't miss the sound of her clipped voice. I had stopped hoping for it to soften. Still, when the twins' birthdays came around, I sent cards, simple ones with bright drawings, and a folded $20 bill inside. Not as a bribe for affection, but as a reminder that I remembered them even if they forgot me. Caleb thanked me in person awkwardly one evening as he reached for another cookie. "Mom doesn't like it when you send things," he admitted. I touched his arm and said, "Then consider it just between us." He nodded, slipping the money into his backpack, and smiled a smile that looked more like his grandfather's than Francis's. The seasons shifted, and the co-op filled with the smell of wood smoke and cinnamon. Harold brought me another mystery novel, this one dog-eared to the last chapter, with his own theories scrawled in pencil. Margot taught me how to prune lavender properly, so it would bloom thicker in the spring. My watercolor of the tomatoes was framed and hung in the hallway next to someone else's portrait of their childhood dog. Every time I walked by, I felt a flicker of belonging. But late one evening, as the sun dipped and shadows stretched long, a letter arrived in my mailbox with Frances's handwriting. My heart hesitated, but I opened it. The words were careful, almost rehearsed. I didn't mean to make you feel unwelcome. I was trying to manage too much at once. Maybe I leaned on you without realizing it. Maybe I forgot you were more than just help. There was no direct apology, only an undercurrent of justification. At the end, she wrote, "If you want to see the kids, I won't stand in your way. But you didn't have to leave like that. You didn't have to take everything with you." I folded the letter, set it aside, and did not respond. It wasn't anger that stopped me, it was clarity. I had spent years, nodding years, shrinking years, hoping to be noticed in the margins of their lives. Leaving had not been cruelty. It had been survival. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is walk away from where you are diminished. That night, I brewed tea in my chipped mug, sat by the window, and watched the moon climb over the rooftops. The lavender shifted in the breeze, brushing against the glass, as though reminding me I was exactly where I belonged. I realized then that freedom isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it looks like a woman in her 80s sitting in the quiet glow of her own kitchen, knowing she is no longer invisible. Winter came gentle to the co-op. Frost touched the window panes in delicate lace, and the courtyard trees stood bare, but proud. Inside, the air stayed warm with the hum of conversation, the clatter of dishes in the shared kitchen, the rustle of knitting needles and shuffled cards. I found myself leaning into the rhythm of it, waking each morning, not to silence, but to the sense of being expected. When I walked into the common room, people greeted me by name, their eyes lighting as though my presence mattered. That more than anything healed something I hadn't realized was still raw. Caleb kept coming. Sometimes he brought sketches from his art class wolves drawn in quick pencil strokes. Sometimes he brought nothing, just himself, slipping off his sneakers at the door like he'd always belonged there. Once, he asked if he could stay the night. I set out blankets on the couch and made hot cocoa in mismatched mugs. He told me about school, about a teacher who encouraged his drawings, about a girl who made him laugh. He fell asleep with his sketchbook open on his chest, and for the first time in years, I felt the deep quiet of a house where someone was glad to be with me. Frances's silence lingered, punctuated only by a holiday card addressed to me, but signed with just her name, no children's scribbles in the corners. I taped it to the fridge anyway, not out of longing, but as a reminder. Proof that once there had been a bridge between us, even if now it had crumbled. I no longer expected repair. The co-op gave me more than I had dared hope. Margot with her lemon scones, Harold with his mystery novels, the watercolor group, who insisted my lavender sketches belonged on the bulletin board. I was no longer invisible. Spring arrived, and with it color. My tomatoes flourished in the shared garden, plump and sweet under the sun. The day the first ripe one fell into my palm, I laughed aloud, startling the woman beside me. "They're perfect," I said, and she nodded knowingly. We sliced them thick for lunch, sprinkled with basil and a touch of salt. The taste burst like memory, bright, simple, alive. I thought of the plants I'd left behind the shed at Frances's, how they withered without sun. This was the difference. Not in the soil itself, but in where it was planted, in whether it was given space to grow. By summer, I had painted nearly a dozen watercolors. My hands weren't as steady as they once were, but the colors carried what words couldn't. I painted lavender stems, ripe tomatoes, even the cracked mug I still used for tea. When the co-op held its annual open house, my paintings lined the wall among others. Strangers paused, admired, asked questions. For the first time in a long while, I felt not only alive, but seen. One evening, Caleb sat at my table while we ate sugar cookies warm from the oven. He looked at me with a seriousness that startled me. "I think you're the bravest person I know," he said. I laughed, shaking my head. But he pressed on. "You left when no one thought you would. You made something new when everyone else wanted you small. That's brave." His words sat with me long after he left, echoing louder than any apology I might have hoped for from Francis. By autumn, the co-op had become not just a refuge, but a home. We celebrated birthdays with potlucks, shared grief in whispered prayers, when one of our own planted bulbs together for the spring. I belonged not because I proved my usefulness, but simply because I existed among them. My lavender bloomed fuller each season, bees drifting lazily through the air, unafraid. The phone rang less often, and I let it. I no longer lived waiting for Francis's voice, nor for the approval she never seemed able to give. One day, I did pick up, if only to answer calmly, when she asked again why I had left so suddenly. I told her the truth in the plainest words I could. I am no longer willing to live in a house where my presence is treated like clutter. I am no longer willing to be erased. There was silence on the line, followed by a sigh, and then nothing. I hung up, set the phone down, and returned to kneading bread with Margot. The truth was simple. Sometimes strength is leaving without slamming the door. Sometimes it's planting lavender in a window box and watching it bloom under the light it was always meant to have. My life had become smaller in some ways, but fuller in all the ways that mattered. I was no longer wallpaper. I was color scent warmth. I was still here, and so I sit most mornings with my tea watching the sunlight pour across the kitchen floor. My chipped mug is steady in my hand, the lavender sways outside, and I write in my journal. Some days it's only a sentence or two. Other days, pages spill out. But each entry begins the same. No one asked me to shrink today. If this story touched you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that remind us of the strength we carry within, even when others forget. And I'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below.